Well, I have a story that is about a man who did not believe in ghosts, and it was collected by a folklorist here in America, Richard Chase. He traveled the South, along the Appalachian Mountains in particular, and he listened to people's stories and he collected them by writing them down and recording them. And this folklorist, Richard Chase, collected many stories, but he kept hearing this one about a haunted house everywhere he went. And it's supposedly one of the earliest American ghost stories. And according to him, and to all those who told it to him, it is true. And it's the story of a preacher who was new to his town. He was meeting people and finding out their stories. And he kept hearing this story over and over again about this one house in the middle of town that was supposedly so haunted that nobody could live in it. Nobody could stay in it overnight without being scared away. And so it was abandoned there in the middle of town, and he felt strongly that the first thing he should do is to dispel this myth so that people would not believe in ghosts anymore and that house could be livable again. And so, letting everyone know, he decided that he would spend the night in that house alone. Armed only with his Bible, everyone watched as he walked up the front steps of the porch into the house and then disappeared for the night. Well, once in the house, he looked high and low. He looked down in the cellar, which was empty, only a dirt floor, the main level, and upstairs, and he found nothing to be concerned about, nothing at all except a rocker, which he brought over to the fireplace, and he built up the fire, and there he sat by that fireplace, reading his Bible by the light of his lantern and the fire. And he was just nodding off. It was late in the night when he heard from the other side of the cellar door the sound of light footsteps, a small person ascending the stairs. But then directly behind that were louder footsteps, the sound of heavy, thumping, thudding footsteps. And then there was the sound of a scream, of a young woman's scream, and it was cut off, and then the sound of a thud, and then the thumping sound of a body being pulled back down into the cellar. And then silence. Well, he was up out of that rocker, and he went to the door, and he went down those same steps he'd just been. And again, he found that it was empty, nothing but the dirt floor. But he felt strongly that he had heard many of those sounds. So this time, when he went back upstairs, he left that door open to the cellar. He turned his chair around away from the fireplace so that he could face the cellar door. And again, he waited. This time, he heard them, just those soft footsteps coming up the stairs. And then, when they reached the top of the stairs, no other sounds followed. He saw a shape begin to materialize there at the top of the stairs. It was a young woman's form, and she was wearing a white flowing gown. And he could see that in her youth she was probably once beautiful, but now the skin was falling away from the bone, and her eye sockets empty except for a blue glowing light. And he was so startled by what had appeared to him that he handled it poorly. And he shouted out, "Who are you? What do you want?" And she just faded, disappeared, down through the floorboards, back down into the cellar. And so, holding his Bible now in front of him like a shield, he waited again. And it wasn't long before he heard those soft footsteps coming up. He saw her begin to materialize again in front of him. And this time he was ready. This time he said the right things. He said calmly and loudly and firmly, he said, "In the name of the Father and the Holy Ghost, who are you and what do you want?" And it was as if his words released her, and she flew at him, and her arms reached out and grabbed him by the lapels of his black coat. She was so close, he could smell her. She smelled of earth and long ago death. And he saw those eye sockets empty but glowing with blue light. He saw the skin so removed that she couldn't speak. But yet words began to come from her, not from her mouth, but from around her. And she began to tell him her story. She told of how she'd loved a man and how he hadn't loved her. He'd only wanted her money. And how he'd killed her and buried her down in the cellar when she wouldn't tell him where her money was. And "Oh, preacher," she said, "won't you dig me up? Give me a proper Christian burial so that I can rest in peace." And the preacher was able to just nod, "Yes." And so she continued, well, before you bury me, break off a bit of my pinky bone and put that in the collection plate this Sunday morning, and you will know who murdered me, and then maybe I can truly rest in peace. Again, he was only able to nod agreement, and she seemed satisfied, and she released the grip on his lapels and again dissolved right there in front of him through the floorboards to her grave below. Well, it took him a while to get himself together, but when he was ready, he got out and he got a shovel and he went down to that cellar again. And it didn't take him long to find her shallow grave there in the dirt. And he exhumed her and brought in a coffin, an old wooden coffin, and he laid her in there, and then he hauled that back out. And when he had her in the church graveyard there in the middle of the night, just the two of them, before he put that lid on her coffin, he broke off a bit of that dry pinky bone of her finger, and he held that back. And then he nailed that lid tight onto the coffin, buried her there, said prayers and words so that she could rest in peace. And then he got ready for his Sunday morning sermon. And that Sunday, he put that little bit of dried bone in the middle of this heavy gold plate with that velvet in the middle. And there it lay, a bit of dry bone. And yet, when he passed it back and forth amongst his congregation, nobody seemed to notice. Nobody commented on it. They just put their money in, as they always did, and passed it to the next person. Round and round it went, until it came to a man that nobody really knew. He was always alone. And he, too, reached into his pocket and brought out a small, small coin. And as he was about to put that into the plate, that bit of bone leapt out of the plate and began to dig itself into the back of his hand. It began to embed itself in the back of the flesh of his hand. And it was so painful and excruciating, he began to scream and yell and draw attention to himself, and he tried to pry that bit of bone out of the back of his hand. But as it got deeper, it seemed to take over his body. And there in front of everyone, he began to confess. He told of how he hadn't really loved her, how he'd only really wanted her money, and how he killed her and buried her down in the cellar, and how he wasn't sorry, but only wanted the pain to stop. And then limp, he just stopped his confession, and two men from the congregation, one on either side, helped him out of the church, down to the judge, where he was convicted of murder. Soon after, he was hung by the neck until dead. It wasn't long after that that the preacher went back to that house to see if she had moved on, if the house was free of her spirit. Well, when he walked through the house, she did seem to be gone. He saw nothing of her, but just as he was passing the fireplace, he began to hear her voice. Her voice was there in the air all around him, and she thanked him for what he'd done. And she did say that she could rest in peace. And she said that her money was there, right there, under the hearthstones. He should dig them up and use that money that had caused so much ill. He should use it for good in the community. And he did. Soon, her voice was also gone, and he knew that house was truly empty of her spirit, that she had moved on. And he dug up that gold, and he used it for decades. There was so much there, he was able to do so much good in the community with that money. And years later, when he was an old man, and you begin to doubt whether things really happened, did you remember them the way they really were? Did that really happen? Whenever he began to doubt the sighting of this ghost, or others questioned him about it, all he had to do was go to that closet where his black coat was that he'd worn so long ago, and there on the lapels where she'd grabbed him in that moment, there were white handprints forever on that coat to remind everyone that the story is indeed true.